Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty and I have another layout for you in my Layout a Day challenge. Now I didn't get a video posted yesterday because I had some tech issues. We're still working on it, but I have a workaround in the meantime. Today's prompt was about telling a story from your hometown, and I decided to go back to where I grew up, and I didn't have any photos from that time period, so I printed some Google Maps from the town that I grew up in, which was a very small town on the coast of California, and it was a farming town. So I've got a story from that. I'm going to be using lots of mixed media techniques today, and so I pulled out my Vicky Boutin Foundations paper, and I always trim off the little perforated edge because that thing bugs me. And I brought out this chicken wire stencil, and I'm going to give it some mists with some old misting sprays. And it took me a little while to get the stencil lined up where I wanted it to go because I decided I wanted the blue of my misting to match up with the ocean on my photo. And so I've got various colors. This is who is this? Diane Reevely. There we go. The Diane Reevely misting sprays, which are still on the market. So I've had mine for a long time, but you can find these still if you don't already own a supply of them like I do. And I've got 2 shades of green and a shade of blue. And then once I've misted it, my stencil will have leftover pigment on it. So I then reverse it and use it as a stamp as well to get some of that excess pigment off. And then I pull out another sheet of the foundations paper, and I'm going to do some stamping and watercoloring. Now this is a stamp set from Stampin' Up! From a long time ago, and I didn't realize I've actually never used this stamp set before. So I've had it for a long time. I was glad to put it to use today. So I'm going to create these little watercolor images that are kind of reminiscent of postcards. I'm using the VersaFine pigment ink because I want to make sure that my ink is waterproof for this watercoloring technique. And now I wanted to try something I haven't tried before, and this is reverse stamping. And I have this stamp set from Paper Smooches. It's called Mirror Blocks, and I was looking at this page trying to figure out what it was called. And what these are basically just giant photopolymer blocks. And what you do with them, mine was a little dirty for some reason, so I gave it a clean, made sure it was nice and dry. And then you stamp onto this block, and then you take the block and stamp with that onto your paper. Now this reverses the image. It also is going to be a lighter tone, and if you have any words, like the back of this truck had the words like apple farm or something like that, it will reverse the words. But I gave myself a few different stamps of various images from this stamp set, and I wasn't sure which ones I was going to want to use. And then I set to watercoloring. So I'm just using the same misters from spraying with my stencil, and I'm just tapping. I unscrew the lid and tap the spray bottle spout onto just a piece of plastic, so that I can create a watercolor palette with the same color palette that I used in my sprays. Now I did pull out a red from a Tim Holtz Distress Stain product, and I'm using that for this truck because I wanted it to look like an old rusty red truck, and I didn't have any reds in my sprays. Okay, so I am putting this watercolor down on this image, and I am keeping a very light color across the whole truck and then adding in the darkest red color to the edges of sections of the truck. So the edge of the door, the edge of the fenders, and that will give me a very simple watercolor image with a little bit of depth and dimension. To get a very light color, you just add more water to your spray, your pigment, and then that will lighten up your color. I do keep this towel handy on the side because you're adding water to the inks already, it can get too puddly, so I will kind of suck up some of that extra pigment or water from my brush onto the towel to kind of keep it from getting too puddly. And then I am going to be mixing up a few other colors in here using these same color palettes. Right now I'm mixing all of the colors, the greens, the reds, and the blues, to create this trying to get a very gray color for the tires. And that green was pretty powerful because it took me a little while to get my gray to not look so green. And I'm just tapping in small amounts of color into parts of these images because they are pretty detailed stamps as it is. I pulled out a silver pen, and I'm just tapping the tip of my silver pen into some of the areas that would reflect the light on shiny bits, so the tires of the truck and the spout of the water pump. And then I'm not going to waste the rest of that pigment, so I just give a spray to my paper and to the palette, and I smush it down onto the rest of my paper, and you'll see what I do with that piece later once it's dry. So I will fussy cut out these images. I'll set that piece aside to dry. Now I'm doing a very broad fussy cut. There's no detail here at all. Very nice wide border, and that's part of what gives it that kind of postcard look to it. And I didn't really actually intend to do that, but once I had it cut out, that's what I realized it looked like, and that's why I wanted that big border. So I was working on this without even realizing why. So I'm going to do a little more mixed media on my background. I have this brand new kind of wave stamp from scrapbook.com, and I'm going to use the leftover spray from when I was spraying that to rub into this stencil, and I'm using a stencil brush here. You do have to be a little light-handed with this because that stencil is very fine, so if you rub it too hard with the brush, you will lift up your stencil. And then I'm doing some ink lifting where I just use water on my brush and I rub over the parts of the stencil that were very saturated with ink, and then I touch them with a tissue, and that will lift up some of the ink. And then wherever your water touches, it's going to reactivate whatever ink is on your background. So I am smoothing out some of these edges that were a little harsh and a little rough. And because that area has a different texture to it, I decided to go ahead and smooth out some of the other areas around the edges so that that additional texture flows across the whole layout and isn't just an isolated bit that seems a little awkward. And that dries pretty quickly. I do kind of give my paper a little bit of fold from behind because wet mediums will warp your paper a little bit. The foundations paper is definitely much easier to work with. I wouldn't do this on regular cardstock because it can pill up and pull the paper apart. So I would definitely recommend something heavier like watercolor paper or this foundations paper by Vicki Boutin. And now I've got my photos back in, and I want to give that bottom photo a little bit of pop off the background. So I pulled out this wood grain washi tape, and that will give it enough dimension without physically giving it dimension. And so I liked that. And then I am going to, I'm attaching it down, and then I'm turning to this other photo. So I am going to physically pop that one up, and at first I was only going to put one level of dimension, and then I decided it needed a little bit more. Now you can't really see it very well on the camera, but in person it does make a difference. And then I'm going to move to doing a technique with that photo. It's like a zoom in technique, and I've done this once before in a video. I'm going to poke a hole in my photo where my house was as a kid. And then I am going to stitch these lines across the photo that go up to that circular cutout piece that I did. And I cut that out because I wanted this zoom effect, and I wanted to really focus in on that part of the photo that had the trailer park that I grew up in, as well as the school across the highway, because that really matches up with the journaling that I'm going to tell this story. And it's really hard to see here, but I'm trying to zoom in for you so that you can see those thread lines that create that zoom effect that you see in, informational graphics kind of things. And I may go back and add a second line of stitching because it is a little subtle and I wanted it to stand out more. So we'll see. So I am moving on to the rest of that piece that I inked up and set aside to dry. I cut out my title on a Cricut. If you don't have an electronic machine, you can certainly die cut this, or of course you could always use letter stickers. But I like this because the letters are all lined up for me based on how the machine cuts them. So I can just use a little piece of washi tape and collect all those letters, and they're perfectly lined up for me. And that washi tape will hold them in place while I put glue on the back. And then I can align them on my layout how I wanted. Now I did have to kind of change up the location of the words a little bit because I wanted it to read coastal farm town as one whole line, but it didn't fit on my layout, so I had to break up farm and town. That's okay, because I put them on separate washi tape pieces, that really did allow me to move them around and make them fit how I want. Now it's hard to see them now. I am going to do a little technique on those to make them stand out a little bit more later. I did pull out some bits from my stash, a little bit of wood veneer items, and I had these little metal keys that I thought I was going to use, but I didn't end up using them. So the little push pins reminded me of putting push pins on a map when you're traveling, and so I use those to kind of indicate the locations on these map photos that I want to use. And then I get my my watercolored images adhered down, and you can really kind of see that postcard effect that you have going on now. And so I outlined with my black journaling pen all of my letters, and you can see that kind of helps the letters stand out a bit more. Okay, so I am not done with that watercolor excess piece that I cut my title out of. And this is why I always save extra pigment, because you can do these kinds of things. I stamped some journaling lines on this piece, and that is going to tuck in there and be my journaling. And I clipped a little arrow shape on there just as an extra set of dimension. Now I wanted to do something to label that map photo up there, but I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. So I just hand wrote home in school, and I was going to come up with some icons or something for that, but I just didn't figure out what would fit. So I got some of my journaling in there, realized I didn't have enough space to finish telling my story, so I finished that. And then because that extra piece had covered up all of my washi tape, I did go ahead and add an extra piece of washi tape. But then that space in between my two journaling blocks was a little awkward, and I realized I did have to leave out part of my story, so it's kind of a sub part of my story, so it fit really nicely into that little section. And I just made a little footnote asterisk on my journaling to go back to that space for more of the story. And that is the layout for today. I will give you some close-ups here of some of these techniques and details that I put into this layout. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be back tomorrow with another Layout a Day layout, and then on the weekend, as kind of a makeup for missing yesterday, I will have a haul video for you, which I don't usually do. So I hope you join me tomorrow and for the weekend, and I will see you then.